In today's tutorial, I'm going to show you exactly how to paint a sweet and simple landscape for your home, and I'm telling you how making stuff like this basically saved my life. No big deal. Hey friends, what's up? Welcome back. My name is Shayda Campbell, and to no one's surprise, I was recently thrifting, came across this cute little frame, $6. I just love the gold color. And since this is our first year in our very first house, I am trying to make art for the walls that I make myself. So that's exactly what we're going to do today. We're going to paint a watercolor landscape, still putting lots of flowers in there. It's going to be sort of this flower field. If that sounds totally new, please don't worry. I'm going to walk you through every step, but I'm also going to do, I guess, a little storytelling, because making art for my own home, in my first home, for my own YouTube channel, I'm saying own a lot, that kind of made me think of something else. How I got here, how I grew up and stopped being a kid and found my way in the world. It's a big story. That sounds like a big story. But I really wanted to talk to you about it today because I know a lot of you are creatives. And sometimes being a creative is hard, especially when you feel like that's your vocation, that's what you should be doing with your day. It's not a straight and narrow path. You don't always know what kind of career you're going to get or how you're going to make, let's just say it, how you're going to make money through those creative and artistic pursuits. That's something I struggled with for a long time. And well, I guess that's kind of the beginning of this story. But before we get into it, like really get into it, let's talk about this project. I have a new nice fresh white mat that will sit in my frame. It's a 5x7, and so I just want to, mark out on my watercolor paper that 5x7 size. I'm using a nice watercolor paper from Canson. It's 140 pound, it's cold pressed. It's not gonna warp or buckle, partly because it's on a block and partly because it's 140 pounds, so it's nice and thick. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. Let's put all of that aside and grab a watercolor sketch pad, something like this Canson XL that I've used for tons of projects on the YouTube channel. It's an inexpensive pad of watercolor paper that is great for practicing and prepping, and that's exactly what we're going to start with today: planning, practicing, and prepping. So grab that sketchbook. That's a long way to say that. Grab a fine liner, a pencil. You'll need some paint brushes. I'm probably going to do this with a couple round brushes like a number 4 and a number 8. You'll need a bit of white gouache for this project. It really makes the whole thing come together, so grab 1 tube of gouache if you can. You need paper towel and 2 glasses of clean water. And then, of course, you need your watercolor set. I'm using the Munyo 48 pans that I typically reach for, but you can use whatever. Oh, and you'll need a little bit of tracing paper. Okay, let's get into it. To start our landscape prep and practice, we're going to sketch 3 rectangles in our watercolor sketch pad, and I'm going to spell landscapes correctly. Okay, that's how we start. Now we're going to have some fun and sketch out some messy landscapes. Honestly, you can look at pictures, but you can also just sketch whatever comes into your mind. For this first one, I did the horizon about 1/3 of the way up, and then I just drew like some random bushes. That's really all I did, with a bit of grass in the front. From there, you could do anything with that upper 2/3 of sky: rain, clouds, a sunset, anything your little heart desires. Go over your sketch in pen to kind of finalize it and refine it a little bit. And from there, we just move on to the next one. This is all about just play and practice. For my next landscape, I'm drawing some hills. The way they kind of almost crisscross, and the fields are all slightly different colors in summer. And maybe the fields have a few trees or bushes in between, with those big puffy clouds up above. That real, like I'm thinking of southern Ontario summer, where there's all those farmer fields, few little trees, mostly just sky and fields. If you feel like you need a photo for this step, by all means grab a photo, but otherwise just draw without pressure and see what you come up with. You've got 3 or as many chances as you like to just try. With that said, let me get back to this old story. So where were we? So when I was younger, I really felt that unless I was going to create the next great Canadian painting or write the great novel of my time, that my art wasn't worth pursuing. I put so much pressure on myself trying to attain a goal that probably would never be in the cards for me that it made it impossible to create anything. I was so afraid to make anything bad or to be irrelevant. And not only that, but I also just couldn't find my way in the world. I struggled with a society that I just didn't feel yielded any response to the human need for meaning, for beauty. I'm not gonna get into it in this video, but I do have a video all about my struggle with addiction. If that's something that you'd like to hear about, it's important for me to talk about it and share, but I'm just not gonna get into it here. I'll link that video in the description below. And I want to talk about how I pulled myself out of that dark time. But first, let's continue our prep and practice. We're just going to add some color to these little watercolor sketches. That's the key about putting the sketch in the watercolor notebook, is that now you can just throw some color on there and see what you like and develop a color palette. I'm using green gray mixed with brown, as well as deep phthalo green mixed with violet. And I'm just sort of mixing all sort of different versions of deep phthalo green and green gray. Remember, with watercolors, you always want to start light and then build. So start with a really, really watery green gray, and then, add a little deep phthalo green on top and let that color bleed out. We're going to build and build and build with these landscapes. That's really the key. So start light. That's the point. As I came out of my addiction and I was trying to come to a healthy place, I just made this decision to start getting involved in the business of my everyday life. So anything that I could make meaning out of, I tried to. Like if I could can my own foods, I tried that. Bake my own sweets. I started knitting. I learned to knit so I could knit my own hats and scarves. Being involved, I guess, in the business of living was a way for me to find beauty and meaning in the everyday. That mindset really informed the start of the YouTube channel. And if you watch my OG trailer from like 2017, I'm talking about being a romantic and just loving travel and poetry and unpaid bills, and how hard it can be to find your way in the world. I think when you do have that sort of romantic soul, I mean, does anybody have an easy time like finding their way as a young person? I don't think so. But these projects, these little projects started bringing me so much joy, and it has never stopped. It's been, like 8 or 9 years of this channel. And we're just doing silly little stuff. It's just this year that I've really gotten into trying to paint landscapes. It's totally new to me. So if this is feeling new or scary to you, I'm right there with you. But I think doing a bunch of little colorful sketches like this, like practice sketches, it does make it more approachable and less scary, because what you see on this page here is all prep and practice. It doesn't really matter if it goes badly. It's actually fun. We're doing 3 sort of simultaneously. So if 2 of them turn out bad, you can be like, oh, well, at least I got this one that I kind of like the look of. That was the good one. That was always supposed to be the good copy. This one at the bottom, I just had a ton of fun with. I sort of, everything comes to a point at the center, the river and all the colorful sky. I did like stripes of blue and pink. I'm just totally playing here, and I hope that you will too. And as we play, let's get back to this story. I was talking about making art just for myself, making silly, mundane things. As soon as I started doing that, all of my love for creative pursuits came rushing back, and I really wanted to share that love, and that's why I started the YouTube channel. And it's so funny because then through just sharing these simple watercolor projects, I didn't know what I was doing. I had just picked up a watercolor set for the first time. I really started loving all these simple, meaningless art projects. Stuff like making a birthday card. It doesn't have this great social context, but it brought me a lot of joy, and it helped me make meaning and beauty in my life. And I really hope all these little projects have brought beauty into your life over the years. So with our 3 practice sketches done, I've traced my 5x7 thing onto another piece of scrap watercolor paper. I'm working in my sketchbook still, and we're going to choose one of those sketches. See, I told you only had to have one good one. And for me, it was that second one, the one where the fields are all kind of intertwining and there's the big puffy clouds. You know, that's the one I can really see in my heart, I feel, because it's, you know, farm country where I'm from. So that's the one I'm going to do. We're going to make it a little bigger and we're going to practice our exact color palette. And this is not the good copy. This is yet another practice. So remember, there's so much power in just play and prep. And that's what we're all about. I'm just sketching everything in the same way we did with a pencil and then a pen. And then I'm going to, you know, start adding some color. This is still super rough and still like very, very sketchy. And I think, again, that's very helpful because there's no pressure. This can turn out poorly. This is all prep. And then when we actually go to do our good copy, we're going to be confident on the subject, the look of the landscape. We're going to be confident with our color choices. So play around and do the prep and practice. If you're following along, I've got all these kind of overlapping layers of hills, and I just want to make each one a slightly different green. So try mixing a little brown into your green, mix a little more water in, maybe mix in a little yellow ochre and get this golden greeny color. And they all just need to be slightly different. They don't need to be wildly different. Remember, keep them light because we're going to build up that color in many, many layers. For the trees, these are sort of silhouettes of trees and brush. We're going to use that deep phthalo green, also mixed with a little bit of brown, and you're just doing a messy motion with the brush. How else can I say it? Almost like a stippling. You're putting down a sort of scribbly texture. And then up front, right in the foreground here, we're going to do long, thin lines to indicate grass, and that's also where all of our flowers will be. So this is the grassy flower field right at the front. On my big puffy clouds, I'm using a very watery French gray, and then you could mix up some French gray with a little less water and maybe work a little wet into wet. So just releasing some darker pigment into the wet area will give you like a nice natural blend or shading on those clouds. For the sky above, try a mix of ultramarine and cobalt with maybe a little Prussian blue or navy to give you that dramatically dark blue summer sky. And as I paint this blue, let me give you a little conclusion to all these rambling thoughts of mine today. So through making art that was just for myself, and that sometimes could be a little silly or a little mundane, through getting creative with the everyday tasks that so many of us do anyway and finding beauty there, and then through sharing that process with you, I rather incredibly find myself with a job, with a full-time position, making YouTube videos and making a living. And that really feels like coming full circle. So sharing this project and this whole story in a YouTube video, it all feels very meta. And I'm finishing the sky and clouds here by doing some blooms. If you don't know what blooms are, it's when you add water to your wet pigment that's already on the paper. It creates this wonderful movement of your pigment. And I'm doing a little lifting there as well. It's a wonderful and very organic, natural looking way to do clouds. And if you're curious about all those sort of beginner level techniques, I do have some watercolor e-courses and they're available on my website. So check those out, shaydacampbell.com. But for now, this is a long video. Let's keep it moving. I've let that practice painting dry and I'm happy with it. And now what we want to do is take that little piece of tracing paper, that supply that I mentioned way back 1,000 years ago at the start of this video, and we're going to trace our final painting here. So you're tracing just a basic trace that shows like the clouds and the brush. And this is a really nice way to take your practice work and transfer it to your good copy paper. So now we're moving out of our watercolor sketch pad. We're going to grab our good paper. That's the Canson 140 pound cold pressed. We take our little piece of tracing paper. We've got one more step. We need to put a layer of graphite on the back of the trace and then set your tracing paper onto your good watercolor paper. and go over it with a nice sharp implement like a mechanical pencil. And that will transfer your image in a really simple, easy way. You can erase it if there's any mistakes. So it's just a very low stakes way to transfer an image or a sketch to your good paper. And that's what mine looks like there. We are now all set up and ready to paint. We have done the prep, we have done the practice, we've done the planning, and now we just get to enjoy and have fun. So I'm starting with a green-gray mixed with a little bit of brown. And the first thing we're going to do is paint those rolling hills. I want to paint one and then switch up the color of green a little bit, maybe add a little bit more water, a little bit of yellow ochre. And we just want to make sure that all four are a slightly different color so that you can tell each hill and each field apart. Keep the paint light, so mix in lots of water. Remember, I said it a million times already, I know, but we want to start light and then build up the color in layers with texture. And if you go really dark at the beginning, it just doesn't give you anywhere to go from there. So keep it light and make sure that those four hills are all slightly different. And then speaking of texture, that's exactly what we're going to start doing. So while that foreground is still lightly wet, the pigment is still a little bit wet, I'm taking a slightly darker green-gray, so maybe a little less water mixed in, a little more brown, and I'm doing these little vertical brush strokes that kind of resemble grass or maybe brush, and I'm also going to do some big messy areas that will look like brush or bush. And so that's exactly what I mean. Start light, and then we're going to build and build up all this texture. And it's a really fun and approachable way to do a painting because you're just doing a layer at a time, and no one layer has to be perfect. You're not trying to do the whole painting in one go. You just do a layer, let it dry, maybe work a little wet into wet, and then come back and add some more. So while we wait for that foreground to dry, we're going to paint in that brush. And the brush you can start a little darker because basically we're painting silhouette. So here I'm using deep phthalo green with a little bit of indigo mixed in and a little bit of Van Dyke brown. And it's giving me, I'm doing that like scribbly, messy kind of stippling that we talked about in our practice. There's still water mixed in there. I'm sure you can tell it's not like super, super dark. So we will be able to layer, but it is a bit darker. And that's the color that I'm going to use as I paint in these areas of tree and brush, and just making little messy brush strokes, muss it up a bit. And as you add the silhouetted tree and brush, don't hesitate to come back into the foreground and start layering there again. Add a little bit of a darker brush and grass, and then maybe go back to those silhouetted trees in the distance and go a little darker. I'm always going a little darker at the base and a little lighter towards the top, towards the more distant area. And I'm going to break from the foreground and I'm going to start painting in that sky. So this is a mix of ultramarine with a whole lot of French gray and a whole lot of water. So just a really light, sort of washed out watery blue. And I'm just trying to paint in that entire area, get it nice and wet. And then when the area is good and wet, I'm going to take a slightly darker blue and I'm just going to release some of that pigment into the wet area. And I'll just kind of see what it does. I want things to look organic. Of course, when you're working wet into wet, you're going to get a wonderful softening of your color. And that's kind of what you want for things like sky and clouds or even water. And as that area continues to dry but is still wet, just keep going. Add a little bit of darker blue, add a little more French gray, just see what happens. If the area is totally dry and you end up just placing some pigment, no worries. Just play and see what you come up with. And then once we're done the sky, we're going to do the same thing with the clouds. So I'm taking a super light French gray. It's just French gray with a whole lot of water, and I am placing that all over the clouds. And then I take a slightly more concentrated French gray, so the gray with just like less water in it, so it's a little darker, and I'm releasing that into the clouds just at random areas, and I'm letting the wet into wet work its magic. I'm getting a really nice softening of every little brush stroke that I put down because the pigment is running into that wet area. And so I get these wonderful, very organic, very natural blends of gray. Same thing with the blue in the sky. It just looks so organic. And you can do a little lifting if you want. That's just using a dry brush to pick up a little of the color and give yourself some highlights. It's a really natural looking highlight that you'll achieve, in fact. And then gosh, from here, we just keep on layering. So I'm taking an even darker green. So this is deep phthalo green mixed with indigo. And I am, layering, doing more of that stippling, scribbly brush stroke on the 2 areas of brush that are sort of in the middle ground here. I want to make sure that some of the lighter brush is still seen, but I do want the silhouette to be darker towards the foreground. I'm also going to place the silhouetted trees that are on the horizon. I had done 2 groups in my sketch, and so I'm placing those as well. And those should just be as random and scribbly as you can stand to make them. You know what I mean? It's hard not to be perfect. And when we're painting nature, try to make things too perfect, too symmetrical, it can actually kind of mess you up because nothing in nature looks that perfect. So try to make things a little weird, a little wrong. And after you finish the silhouetted bits, just keep on layering. Do some spots and random brush marks at the very base of the painting in the foreground here, because this is going to be flower fields and flower shrubs and brush and grass. And so we just want loads and loads of texture. And with those fields that are farther off, you can do some thin little horizontal brush strokes and to give it the look of rolling hay fields or potentially crops or something like that. So keep on keeping on with the texture and just layering in lots and lots of darker color a little bit at a time. This process of layering and adding texture and adding all that shading, it takes a little time, but it can be really chill. You're just going little by little, taking a step back, seeing what you need. So go slow. And then when you're happy with it, it doesn't have to be totally done, but when you're pretty happy with it and you've built up that contrast and texture, that's when we're going to reach for that gouache. So go ahead and grab your white gouache. We're going to squeeze a little onto a plate or a palette. And you're going to want to change your water. So grab some nice, fresh, clean water because it will color the gouache. And we're going to mix water into that gouache. It comes out of the tube, the consistency of toothpaste. You want it to be quite liquidy, quite watery when it goes on the paper. And we're just going to get a little on the end of your brush, and we're going to start adding some sweet little flowers, sort of flowers in air quotes, because you're just really painting little X's and dots. Think of painting tiny little messy heart shapes and really just lots of dots and more scribbles and all that stuff. And we are going to fill the foreground with these really pretty little white flowers. We want it to look like a field that's just filled with daisies or dandelions or whatever. And I've sort of painted these 2 dark shrubs right at the front. So I'm going to add a lot of flowers right there. And then I'm also going to add flowers and basically just dots all along that first field, especially where the eye would still be able to see flowers if in fact you were standing there. When adding flowers, again, flowers in air quotes, farther up into the middle ground, you're just doing the tiniest of teeny tiny little dots. And while you have your white gouache out, if you would like to add more white to your clouds, if they got too gray or you just feel like they need more highlights, more white, gouache is great for that. You can actually add light on top of dark with watercolors when you, can kind of cheat with gouache. So I added a little bit of white and then I softened it just using a wet brush. Then I went back in with some blue watercolor and just kind of perfected the upper poofy line of that cloud. And that's what you see me doing there. And then I was pretty happy, pretty much all done. At this point, if you have another color of gouache, like yellow or pink, you could add some more color to this flower field. You actually can add a little watercolor into your white gouache as well. So if you only have the tube of white gouache, because I know I've recommended that in the past, like just get one tube of white if you're only gonna buy one. So you could add some pink watercolor to your white gouache and do the same thing. But again, I'm just doing like some dotting, some random shapes. We wouldn't actually be able to make anything out if we were looking at a field of flowers. You would just kind of see color. We're going for that kind of impressionistic look. So don't overthink it and just make some marks. Making some marks, that's all we're doing until we are done. And I think that my painting is just about done. I'm gonna rinse my brush. I'm gonna step back, just have a look. You know, it's always good to take a breather, get a second away from your painting and come back to it with fresh eyes. But for me, I think that I'm happy with that. And so I let it dry. And then I opened up this sort of gross, dusty old frame. I washed the glass. I took out all the old moldy mats and paper, and I spruced her up with a fresh white mat and an original floral field watercolor by yours truly. I'm all about that thrift shopping and not just running out and purchasing something new when I need something or want something for my home. This took one afternoon and she looks so cute, and it's a really special piece. Well, friends, thank you so much for hanging out and making something really, really pretty. I'm super proud of this. This was new for me as well. I've only done a couple watercolor landscapes, and I think I've shared that journey pretty much here just in 2023. So if you want more watercolor landscape tutorials, I will link them in the video description. Thank you for hanging out. Make sure to hit that subscribe button for more content like this, and I will see you soon with a new tutorial.